Officer Marcus Thompson had been guarding the gates of Buckingham Palace for 12 years. At 35, he stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a perfectly pressed red uniform that commanded respect from tourists and locals alike. His black bearskin hat added another foot to his imposing presence, and his polished boots reflected the morning sun like mirrors. It was a typical Tuesday morning in July when everything changed. The summer crowds were already gathering by 9 o'clock, phones ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Marcus stood perfectly still at his post, rifle held at attention, eyes focused straight ahead. This was his duty, his honor, and he took it seriously. The morning started like any other. Tourists snapped photos, children pointed excitedly at his colorful uniform, and parents whispered explanations about the royal guards to their curious kids. Marcus had learned to tune out the constant chatter and camera clicks. He was a living statue, a symbol of British tradition and discipline. Then she arrived. Lady Catherine Pemberton Smythe stepped out of a gleaming black Bentley, her designer heels clicking against the pavement. At 42, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Her perfectly styled blonde hair caught the morning breeze, and her Chanel suit probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months. Behind her emerged her son, Reginald, a pudgy 12-year-old with angry eyes and a permanent scowl. Catherine surveyed the crowd of tourists with obvious disgust. These common people with their loud voices and cheap cameras were beneath her notice. After all, she was practically royalty herself. Her great-grandfather had been a baron, and she never let anyone forget it. Reginald kicked at a pigeon and complained loudly about everything he saw. The tourists were too noisy. The sun was too bright, and he was bored already. His mother had promised him something special today, something that would make all his friends at his expensive private school jealous. Marcus noticed them immediately, though he gave no outward sign. Years of training had taught him to observe everything while appearing to see nothing. The woman's entitled posture and the boy's bratty behavior were familiar sights among certain visitors. He had dealt with their type before. Catherine approached one of the other guards first, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She explained that little Reginald was fascinated by the royal guards and simply had to have his picture taken with one. Not just any tourist photo, mind you, but something special. Something that would show how important the Pemberton Smythe family was. The guard politely explained that they were not allowed to break their stance or interact with visitors during duty hours. It was a sacred tradition, he said, one that went back centuries. Catherine's smile faltered slightly, but she pressed on. Surely there could be an exception for someone of her standing. When the guard remained unmoved, Catherine's mask began to slip. Her voice grew sharper, more demanding. Did he know who she was? Her family had connections throughout the government. A simple photo wouldn't hurt anyone. Reginald grew impatient with his mother's diplomatic approach. He had been promised something exciting, and standing around talking to boring adults wasn't his idea of fun. He began to wander closer to Marcus, studying the guard's perfectly still form with growing fascination. The boy had never been denied anything in his 12 years of life. Every toy, every experience, every whim had been instantly gratified by his wealthy parents. The concept of someone refusing to do what he wanted was completely foreign to him. As his mother continued her increasingly heated discussion with the other guard, Reginald made a decision. If these guards wouldn't cooperate, he would make them cooperate. After all, they were just servants, weren't they? People who existed to entertain him and make him happy. Marcus felt the boy's presence before he saw him. Years of military training had honed his peripheral vision and situational awareness to razor sharpness. He could sense Reginald circling, him like a predator studying its prey, looking for weakness or opportunity. The crowds of tourists had grown thicker as the morning progressed. School groups arrived in chattering bunches, their teachers trying to maintain order while explaining the historical significance of what they were seeing. Japanese visitors bowed respectfully at the guards, understanding the honor and discipline required for such a position. American families posed for endless selfies, their children wide-eyed with wonder at the real-life fairy tale scene. Through it all, Marcus remained perfectly still. His breathing was controlled, his posture flawless. his expression neutral. This was more than just a job to him. It was a calling, a tradition passed down through generations of soldiers who had served the crown with unwavering loyalty. But Reginald saw none of this honor or tradition. To him, Marcus was just another obstacle to overcome, another adult who needed to be put in his place. The boy's friends at school would never believe he had made one of the famous guards break character. It would be the ultimate trophy, the perfect story to cement his reputation as someone who could get away with anything. Catherine's voice grew louder as her frustration mounted. She name-dropped political connections and threatened to call her lawyer. The other guard remained professionally polite but absolutely unmovable in his refusal to accommodate her demands. Security personnel began to take notice of the disturbance, but protocol required them to let the guards handle the situation first. Marcus could feel the tension building like electricity in the air before a thunderstorm. His instincts, sharpened by years of military service and guard duty, told him that something was about to happen. The boy's presence had shifted from curious to predatory, and the mother's entitled demands were escalating beyond normal tourist behavior. What happened next would test every ounce of Marcus's training, professionalism, and self-control. It would also reveal the true character of both the spoiled child and his equally spoiled mother, setting in motion a chain of events that none of them could have predicted. Reginald made his move while his mother was still arguing with the other guard. He had spotted what he thought was the perfect opportunity to get the reaction he wanted. With the confidence of a child who had never faced real consequences, he reached out and poked Marcus hard in the ribs. Nothing happened. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't even blink. His training was too deep, his discipline too strong. He had endured far worse during his military service and guard training. A spoiled child's poke was nothing compared to standing at attention for hours in driving rain or scorching heat. But Reginald wasn't discouraged. If anything, the guard's lack of response only made him more determined. He had found a new game, and he intended to win it. The boy began circling Marcus more aggressively, looking for weak spots. He tried waving his hands in front of the guard's face, making funny noises, and even jumping up and down. Each failed attempt only fueled his growing frustration and determination. Several tourists noticed what was happening and began to murmur disapprovingly. Some tried to gently suggest that Reginald should leave the guard alone, but the boy ignored them completely. In his world, the opinions of strangers meant nothing. Only his own desires mattered. Marcus remained perfectly still, but inside his mind was working furiously. He had dealt with disruptive tourists before, but usually a stern look or a quiet word from security was enough to end the situation. This boy seemed different somehow, more determined and less aware of boundaries than most children. Catherine finally noticed her son's behavior when a Japanese tourist politely tapped her shoulder and pointed toward Reginald. Her first instinct wasn't to stop him, but to defend him. After all, if her precious boy wanted to play with the guard, who were these common people to object? She strode over to where Reginald was now trying to untie Marcus's bootlaces, her voice loud enough for half the courtyard to hear. "Reggie, darling, what are you doing? These people seem to think you're bothering this man, but I told them he's just playing, isn't that right?" The question was directed at Marcus, but of course he couldn't answer. Royal guards were forbidden from speaking while on duty except in cases of genuine emergency. Catherine took his silence as agreement and smiled triumphantly at the concerned tourists. "You see, everything is perfectly fine. My son is just having a bit of fun with the nice guard." But Reginald was far from finished. The bootlaces hadn't budged and the guard still hadn't moved. If anything, his target seemed even more statue-like than before. This called for more drastic measures. The boy began to push against Marcus's legs, trying to make him lose his balance. When that didn't work, he started pulling on the guard's red tunic. The fabric was strong and well-made, designed to withstand the rigors of ceremonial duty, but Reginald's grabbing and pulling was beginning to cause small wrinkles and displacement. Group of American tourists had started filming the entire incident on their phones. Some were laughing, thinking it was cute or funny to see a child playing with the stoic guard. Others looked uncomfortable and whispered among themselves about whether someone should intervene. Marcus could feel his uniform being disturbed, but still, he remained motionless. However, his jaw muscles tightened almost imperceptibly. His uniform wasn't just clothing. It was a symbol of his service, his honor, and his commitment to the crown. Every piece had been carefully pressed and positioned that morning. Every button, every crease, every detail was perfect. An elderly British gentleman in the crowd couldn't stay quiet any longer. He approached Catherine with the polite but firm manner that only comes from generations of proper upbringing. "Excuse me, madam, but I believe your son might be disturbing the guard's uniform. Perhaps it would be best if—" Catherine whirled around with fury in her eyes. "How dare you tell me how to manage my child? Do you have any idea who I am? My family has been part of British society for generations. We have every right to be here, and if Reggie wants to interact with the guards, then that's what he'll do." The gentleman stepped back, taken aback by her vehemence. He had simply been trying to help, but Catherine's reaction made it clear that reasoning with her would be impossible. Meanwhile, Reginald had discovered Marcus's ceremonial sword. The gleaming blade was secured in its sheath, but the ornate handle fascinated the boy. He began tugging at it, trying to pull it free. This crossed a line that even Marcus's incredible discipline couldn't ignore. The sword wasn't just a ceremonial piece. It was a working weapon, and allowing an untrained civilian to handle it could be dangerous. More importantly, it was a breach of security protocol that could have serious consequences. For the first time since the incident began, Marcus moved. It was barely perceptible, just a slight shift in his stance that moved the sword slightly out of Reginald's reach. But the boy noticed immediately and took it as a sign of victory. "Mummy, I made him move. I made the guard move," Reginald shouted, excitedly, jumping up and down with glee. Catherine beamed with pride at her son's achievement. She began applauding and encouraging him to do it again. "That's wonderful, darling. You're so clever. I knew you could make him react." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some tourists continued filming and laughing, treating it like entertainment. Others looked increasingly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. A few began to walk away, clearly disturbed by the family's behavior. Security personnel stationed around the palace had been monitoring the situation from a distance. They were trained to handle disruptions without interfering with the guards' duties unless absolutely necessary. So far, the incident hadn't reached that threshold, but it was getting close. Reginald, emboldened by his mother's praise and what he saw as his first victory, decided to escalate his efforts. He began jumping up and trying to knock Marcus's famous bearskin hat off his head. The hat was secured, but the boy's repeated impacts were jarring and disrespectful. Marcus's hands tightened imperceptibly around his rifle. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to react, to put this spoiled child in his place and restore order. But his training held firm. He was a royal guard, a symbol of discipline and control. He would not let a child, no matter how obnoxious, break his professional composure. But inside, something was building. 12 years of perfect service, of maintaining dignity in the face of every provocation, of representing the best of British military tradition, and now this entitled child was treating him like a toy for his amusement. The breaking point was coming, and when it arrived, everyone present would learn that there are consequences for pushing a trained soldier too far, even one bound by the strictest rules of conduct. The real shock was yet to come. The situation spiraled completely out of control when Reginald discovered Marcus's polished boots. The boy had been trying unsuccessfully to get a bigger reaction from the guard, and his frustration was mounting with each failed attempt. In his spoiled mind, this was unacceptable. Nobody ignored Reginald Pemberton Smythe. That's when he noticed how perfectly shiny the guard's boots were. They gleamed like black mirrors, reflecting the morning sun and representing hours of careful polishing and maintenance. To Marcus, those boots were a point of pride, a symbol of his attention to detail and military precision. To Reginald, they looked like the perfect target. Without warning, the 12-year-old lifted his foot and stomped down hard on Marcus's perfectly polished left boot, leaving a dirty sneaker print right across the gleaming leather. The crowd gasped audibly. Even the tourists who had been laughing moments before fell silent. There was something universally understood about crossing that particular line. You simply didn't deliberately damage someone's uniform, especially not a ceremonial guard's pristine appearance. Marcus felt the impact both physically and emotionally. The boot could be cleaned and polished again, but the disrespect behind the act cut much deeper. In 12 years of service through rain, snow, heat, and countless difficult tourists, no one had ever deliberately vandalized his uniform. For just a fraction of a second, his mask slipped. His eyes flicked down to look at the dirty print on A, his boot, then back up to stare straight ahead. It was the smallest possible reaction, lasting maybe half a second, but Reginald caught it and squealed with delight. "I did it again. I made him look. Mummy, did you see? I made the soldier look at his boot." Catherine was practically glowing with pride at her son's accomplishment. She pulled out her expensive phone and began recording, encouraging Reginald to do it again for the camera. "That's marvelous, darling. You're so creative. Do it again so Mummy can get it on video to show Daddy and all your friends." The elderly British gentleman from earlier stepped forward again, his face red with indignation. "Madam, this has gone quite far enough. Your son has damaged this guard's uniform and you're encouraging him to do it again? Have you no sense of decency?" Catherine turned on him with vicious intensity. "Mind your own business, you old fool. My son can do whatever he pleases. These guards are public servants, which means they serve the public and we are the public. If we want to interact with them, that's our right." Her voice was loud enough that people several yards away turned to stare. Other tourists began pulling out their phones, but now they were recording the confrontation rather than treating it as entertainment. Reginald, high on his perceived victories and his mother's encouragement, decided to push even further. He stepped back and delivered another stomping blow to Marcus's right boot, this time grinding his heel against the leather to maximize the damage. The crowd's reaction was immediate and negative. What had started as confused amusement had turned into genuine disgust at the family's behavior. Several people began shouting at Catherine to control her child, while others called for security. But security was already moving. 2 plainclothes officers had been watching the situation develop, and the deliberate vandalism of a guard's uniform was finally enough to justify intervention. They began making their way through the crowd, speaking quietly into their radios. As they approached, Marcus remained perfectly still, but everyone watching could sense that something fundamental had changed. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension. His breathing remained controlled, his posture unchanged, but there was an energy building around him that made even casual observers step back slightly. Catherine noticed the crowd's negative reaction and became defensive. Instead of recognizing that her son had crossed a line, she doubled down on her entitlement. "How dare you people judge my parenting? Do you know what my family has contributed to this country? We have every right to be here. And if my son wants to play with the guards, then that's exactly what he'll do." She gestured dismissively at the concerned tourists. "You're all just jealous that Reggie has the courage to actually interact with them instead of just standing there taking boring pictures like sheep." Reginald, feeding off his mother's energy and the attention from the crowd, decided to attempt his most ambitious provocation yet. He had noticed that the guard carried a ceremonial cord attached to his uniform, part of the traditional dress that dated back centuries. The boy reached out and grabbed the cord, giving it a sharp yank. That was the moment everything changed. Cord was connected to several parts of Marcus's uniform, and Reginald's violent tug caused multiple disruptions at once. Buttons strained, fabric pulled, and most importantly, the boy's action actually moved Marcus slightly off balance. For a royal guard, maintaining perfect posture and position isn't just about discipline. It's about honor, tradition, and respect. For centuries of service, being physically forced out of position by a spoiled child was beyond unacceptable. Marcus's training had prepared him for many situations, but it had also given him tools that went far beyond simply standing still. He was a soldier first, a ceremonial figure second, and soldiers know how to respond to physical assault even when they're wearing a fancy uniform. The crowd held its breath. Catherine continued filming, oblivious to the dangerous line her son had just crossed. Reginald stood there grinning, proud of his latest victory, and already planning his next move. They had no idea that they had just awakened something much more formidable than a tourist attraction in a colorful costume. They had provoked a trained military professional who had been pushed beyond the limits of even his extraordinary patience. What happened next would become the most talked-about incident in the history of Buckingham Palace security, and it would teach a spoiled child and his entitled mother a lesson they would never forget. The real shock was about to begin, and it would be captured on dozens of phones from every angle, ensuring that the whole world would witness what happens when you push a royal guard too far. The transformation was instant and terrifying. Marcus Thompson, who had stood like a statue for the past 20 minutes while enduring increasingly aggressive harassment, suddenly came to life with the precision and power of a military machine. But he didn't break protocol. Instead, he used it. Halt! The command exploded from his lips like thunder, echoing off the palace walls and cutting through every other sound in the courtyard. His voice carried the authority of 12 years of military service and countless hours of training. It wasn't just loud. It was commanding in a way that reached into the primitive part of every person's brain and demanded immediate obedience. Reginald, who had been reaching for another part of Marcus's uniform, froze completely. His hand stopped in midair, his mouth fell open, and for the first time in his spoiled life, he experienced genuine fear. This wasn't like when his nanny raised her voice or when his headmaster gave him detention. This was something primal and overwhelming. The entire crowd went silent. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Camera phones wavered in suddenly shaking hands. Even crying babies seemed to pause in startled quiet. The sound had been so powerful, so unexpected, that everyone within 50 yards felt its impact. Catherine dropped her phone, the expensive device clattering on the pavement as she stared in shock at the guard who had suddenly revealed himself to be something far more intimidating than a tourist attraction. But Marcus wasn't finished. Protocol allowed guards to issue verbal commands when their security or the security of the palace was threatened. And Reginald's physical assault on his uniform and equipment definitely qualified. Step back from the guard. His second command was even more forceful than the first, delivered with the kind of authority that had once commanded soldiers in combat situations. Marcus's entire posture had changed. He was still at attention, still following protocol, but now everyone could see the trained warrior beneath the ceremonial uniform. Reginald stumbled backward, tears beginning to form in his eyes. He had never experienced anything like this. His whole world was built on the assumption that adults would either give him what he wanted, or, at worst, speak to him in carefully modulated, respectful tones. The idea that someone might actually command him, might use real authority against him, was completely foreign and terrifying. The security officers who had been approaching broke into a run. They knew that when a royal guard issued verbal commands, the situation had escalated beyond tourist management into actual security protocol. Their radios crackled with urgent communications as additional personnel were summoned. Marcus continued his verbal intervention, each word precisely chosen and delivered with military efficiency. You are interfering with a royal guard in the performance of his duties. This is a criminal offense under the Public Order Act. Catherine finally found her voice, but it came out as a strangled squeak rather than her usual imperious tone. You can't talk to us like that. We're just tourists. Reggie was just playing. Marcus turned his gaze directly to her for the first time, and Catherine felt the full weight of his professional assessment. His eyes weren't angry or emotional. They were cold, calculating, and completely in control. She suddenly realized that she had made a terrible miscalculation about who she was dealing with. Madam, your child has committed assault on a member of Her Majesty's Guard, damaged crown property, and interfered with official duties. You have encouraged and filmed these criminal acts. The words hit Catherine like physical blows. Criminal acts? Assault? Her precious Reggie hadn't done anything criminal. He was just a child having fun. But looking around at the crowd's faces, she saw no sympathy, no support for her position. Instead, she saw judgment, disgust, and in some cases, satisfaction that someone was finally holding her accountable. Reginald had begun to cry in earnest now, not the manipulative tears he usually used to get his way, but genuine sobs of fear. and confusion. The world had suddenly become a place where his actions had consequences, where adults could say no to him with real authority, and where his mother's money and connections couldn't protect him. The first security officers reached the scene, and Marcus smoothly transitioned from verbal commands to professional briefing. "Officers, this child has physically assaulted my uniform and equipment on multiple occasions. The mother has encouraged and recorded these acts. Several witnesses can confirm the incident." His voice had returned to normal volume, but the authority remained. Everyone present understood that they were no longer dealing with a silent ceremonial figure, but with a trained law enforcement professional who was completely in control of the situation. Catherine tried to reassert herself as the security officers approached. "This is ridiculous. We're British citizens. We pay taxes that fund this palace. You can't treat us like criminals." But her voice lacked its earlier confidence. The public humiliation, the crowd's obvious disapproval, and Marcus's devastating professional response had shaken her to her core. For the first time in years, she was facing a situation where her sense of entitlement was not only useless, but actively working against her. One of the security officers, a veteran with 20 years of experience dealing with difficult visitors, stepped forward with polite but firm authority. "Madam, I'm going to need to ask you and your son to step aside while we sort this out. We have multiple witnesses to incidents of harassment and damage to official property." The crowd had grown substantially as word spread through the tourist areas about the confrontation. Dozens of phones were now recording every moment, capturing Catherine's humiliation and Reginald's tears for posterity. The videos would be online within minutes, spreading across social media with titles like "Entitled Oh, Mom Gets Destroyed by Royal Guard and Spoiled Kid Learns Hard Lesson at Buckingham Palace." But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As security began to take statements from witnesses, as Catherine's bluster turned to desperate attempts at damage control, and as Reginald learned for the first time that the world didn't revolve around his wishes, Marcus quietly returned to his position. Within moments, he was once again the perfect statue, standing at attention with unwavering discipline. His breathing was controlled, his posture flawless, his expression neutral. Only the dirty footprints on his boots remained as evidence of what had just transpired. The transformation was so complete, so professional, that it left everyone who witnessed it with a profound understanding of what they had just seen. This wasn't just a man in a fancy costume. This was a highly trained professional who had shown remarkable restraint in dealing with an impossible situation, and who had demonstrated that respect and discipline weren't signs of weakness but of incredible strength. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Within 15 minutes of Marcus's commanding intervention, Catherine and Reginald found themselves in a small, sterile office inside Buckingham Palace security headquarters. The opulent tourist areas had given way to purely functional government spaces, and Catherine's sense of entitlement was crumbling with each passing moment. Detective Inspector Sarah Williams sat across from them, her notebook open and her expression professionally neutral. At 45, she had investigated everything from petty theft to terrorism threats, but cases involving tourists assaulting royal guards always drew special attention from her superiors. "Mrs. Pemberton Smythe," she began, her voice calm but authoritative, "we have statements from 17 witnesses, including 4 police officers and 2 security personnel. We also have video evidence from multiple sources showing your son's actions and your encouragement of those actions." Catherine tried to maintain her earlier defiance, but it sounded hollow in the small room. "Inspector, I think there's been a tremendous misunderstanding. Reggie is just 12 years old. He was excited to see the guards, and children sometimes get carried away. Surely you don't prosecute children for being enthusiastic about British history." Detective Inspector Williams had heard every excuse imaginable over the years, but Catherine's particular brand of entitled deflection was especially grating. She opened her folder and pulled out several printed photographs taken from phone videos. "These images show your son deliberately stomping on Guard Thompson's boots, pulling at his uniform cords, and attempting to remove equipment from his person. They also show you filming these actions and encouraging him to repeat them when witnesses objected." The photographs were devastating. Catherine had thought the incident would make for amusing family stories, but seeing it from an objective perspective, made her behavior look inexcusably awful. Reginald, meanwhile, had stopped crying but remained slouched in his chair, looking smaller and more confused than she had ever seen him. Furthermore, the inspector continued, Guard Thompson has been on duty for over 12 years without a single disciplinary incident. His service record is exemplary, and his account of events is corroborated by multiple independent witnesses. Catherine's lawyer instincts, developed through years of threatening legal action to get her way, kicked. I want to speak to my solicitor, and I want to file a complaint against that guard for shouting at my son. Children shouldn't be subjected to that kind of intimidation. Detective Inspector Williams actually smiled at that, though it wasn't a friendly expression. Mrs. Pemberton Smythe, Guard Thompson followed protocol exactly as he was trained to do. When a member of the public physically assaults a royal guard and damages crown property, the guard is authorized to issue verbal commands to restore order and ensure security. If anything, his restraint was remarkable. She pulled out another document from her folder. I've reviewed the security footage from multiple angles. Your son made physical contact with the guard at least 8 times, damaged his boots, disrupted his uniform, and attempted to remove his ceremonial sword. Any one of those actions could be prosecuted as assault or vandalism. The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Catherine was beginning to understand that her usual tactics weren't working. There would be no manager to demand to speak to, no family connections to invoke, no angry phone calls to make everything disappear. Reginald finally spoke up, his voice small and uncertain. Am I going to prison? Detective Inspector Williams looked at him with something approaching sympathy. Children, even badly behaved ones, were often victims of their parents' poor decisions. That depends on several factors, Reginald. What you did was serious, but the courts take your age into account when deciding consequences. Catherine felt panic rising in her chest. Prison? Courts? This was supposed to be a fun family outing, a chance to show off for Reginald's school friends. How had it turned into a criminal matter? Inspector, please, let's be reasonable here. I'm sure we can work something out. My husband has significant business interests, and we're prepared to make a substantial donation to any charity you might suggest. Perhaps something for the Guard's benevolent fund. The attempt at bribery was so clumsy that Detective Inspector Williams actually looked offended. Mrs. Pemberton Smythe, are you attempting to influence a police investigation with offers of money? Catherine backpedaled frantically. No, of course not. I just meant that if there was any damage, we'd be happy to pay for cleaning or repairs, as a gesture of goodwill. But the damage went far beyond dirty boots or wrinkled fabric. In the hours since the incident, the video footage had exploded across social media. Royal Guard revenge was trending on Twitter, with millions of views and thousands of comments overwhelmingly supporting Marcus's handling of the situation. The story had been picked up by major news outlets across the globe. The Daily Mail's headline read, "Spoiled brat gets royal treatment," while international news services ran it as a human interest story about British military discipline triumphing over entitled behavior. Back at Buckingham Palace, Marcus had completed his shift with his usual professionalism, though his fellow guards and superiors had made it clear that his handling of the situation was exemplary. The dirty footprints on his boots had been photographed for evidence before being carefully cleaned away, and his uniform had been restored to its pristine condition. But for Catherine and Reginald, the real consequences were just beginning. Detective Inspector Williams closed her folder and leaned back in her chair. Here's what's going to happen, she said with finality. Formal charges will be filed against both of you. Reginald will face charges in youth court for assault and vandalism. You, Mrs. Pemberton Smythe, will face charges for aiding and abetting. Those crimes, as well as disturbing the peace and failing to control a minor in your care. Catherine's face went white. Charges, real criminal charges, but we're respectable people. This will ruin our reputation. Your reputation was ruined the moment you encouraged your son to assault a royal guard and filmed it for your amusement, Detective Inspector Williams replied coldly. The question now is whether you'll take responsibility for your actions or continue to make excuses. As they were formally processed and released pending their court dates, Catherine realized that her privileged world was crashing down around her. The incident would follow them forever, archived in digital perpetuity and associated with their names in every internet search. But perhaps most shocking of all was the realization that they had brought it entirely upon themselves. In their arrogance and entitlement, they had chosen to pick a fight with someone who represented everything they were not: discipline, honor, duty, and genuine strength. The Royal Guard had won this battle without throwing a punch, firing a shot, or even breaking his professional composure. He had simply shown them what real authority looked like, and the contrast with their petty bullying had been devastating. The story was far from over, but the lesson had already been taught. Some lines should never be crossed, and some people command respect whether you choose to give it or not. 3 months later, the consequences were still unfolding like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. Marcus Thompson stood at his usual post outside Buckingham Palace, but everything had changed. Tourists still gathered to watch the guards, but now there was a different kind of respect in their behavior. Word had spread through the tourism community about what happened to people who disrespected the royal guards, and the lesson had been absorbed by millions of potential visitors worldwide. The video of the incident had been viewed over 50 million times across various platforms. News outlets from CNN to the BBC had covered the story, with most praising Marcus's professional handling of an impossible situation. Military veterans around the world had shared the footage with pride, seeing it as a perfect example of how discipline and training could triumph over entitled behavior without resorting to violence. For Marcus personally, the fame was both a blessing and a burden. He had received thousands of messages of support from fellow service members, law enforcement officers, teachers, and parents who saw him as a symbol of standing up to bullying behavior. The palace had even received formal commendations from military organizations in 12 different countries, but Marcus remained the same disciplined professional he had always been. The attention made him uncomfortable, though he understood its importance. In interviews with military publications, he consistently emphasized that he had simply followed his training and done his duty. He gave credit to his fellow guards, his superior officers, and the traditions that had shaped his response. The real shock, however, was what had happened to the Pemberton Smythe family. Catherine had hired the most expensive legal team she could find, but they had delivered devastating news. The evidence against her was overwhelming, the public opinion was entirely negative, and the prosecution was determined to make an example of the case. Her lawyers strongly recommended accepting a plea agreement. In youth court, Reginald had received a suspended sentence, 200 hours of community service, and mandatory counseling. The judge had been stern but fair, emphasizing that actions have consequences regardless of one's family background or financial status. The boy would spend the next year working with veterans organizations and learning about military service and sacrifice. Catherine's punishment had been much harsher. She received a criminal conviction, a substantial fine, and her own community service requirement. But the social consequences were far worse than the legal ones. The exclusive private school that Reginald attended had quietly suggested that the family might be happier elsewhere. The country club where Catherine played tennis had suspended her membership pending review. Even their housekeeper had quit, embarrassed to be associated with employers who had become international symbols of entitled behavior. Most devastating of all, Catherine's husband had filed for divorce. A successful businessman with political ambitions, he couldn't afford to be associated with someone who had become a laughingstock around the world. The divorce proceedings had become tabloid fodder, with every detail of Catherine's privileged lifestyle being scrutinized and mocked. But perhaps the most shocking transformation was in Reginald himself. The community service had placed him in a veterans rehabilitation center where he worked alongside men and women who had served their country with honor. At first, he had been sullen and resentful, expecting special treatment because of his age and family status. But the veterans had a different approach to discipline than the private tutors and indulgent adults he was used to. They didn't shout at him or punish him harshly. Instead, they simply expected him to meet their standards. and they refused to accept anything less. When he complained or made excuses, they listened politely and then explained exactly why his behavior was unacceptable and what he needed to do differently. For the first time in his life, Reginald found himself surrounded by adults who commanded genuine respect rather than demanding it. These were people who had faced real challenges, made real sacrifices, and earned their authority through service to others rather than inherited privilege. Slowly, grudgingly, he began to change. The counseling sessions had been equally transformative. The therapist had helped him understand how his privileged upbringing had isolated him from the real world and from genuine relationships with other people. He began to see how his mother's behavior had modeled entitlement and disrespect, and how he had unconsciously adopted those same patterns. 3 months after the incident, Reginald asked his court-appointed guardian if he could write a letter to Marcus Thompson. The letter, which would later be published in several newspapers with both parties' permission, was simple but profound. Dear Guard Thompson, I know I can't take back what I did to you, but I want you to know that I understand now why it was wrong. You were doing your job with honor and I treated you like a toy. I'm learning about what real service means now, and I hope someday I can serve my country the way you do. Thank you for teaching me that respect has to be earned, not demanded. Sincerely, Reginald Pemberton Smythe. Marcus had been moved by the letter and had responded with characteristic grace, encouraging the boy to continue learning and growing. He emphasized that everyone makes mistakes, but what matters is how we learn from them and become better people. The story had become more than just a viral video or a news headline. It had become a teaching moment for parents, educators, and society as a whole. Discussion forums were filled with debates about privilege, discipline, and the importance of teaching children respect for others. Military recruitment offices reported increased interest from young people who had been inspired by Marcus's example of disciplined service. Tourism to Buckingham Palace had actually increased, with visitors coming specifically to see the famous guards and to witness the tradition and discipline they represented. But for Marcus, standing at his post on another ordinary morning, the most important outcome was simpler. Children who visited with their families now approached the guards with obvious respect and curiosity, rather than viewing them as entertainment. Parents were more careful to teach their children about the history and honor represented by the ceremonial guards. The incident had become a reminder that in a world where viral fame often rewards bad behavior, sometimes the most powerful response is simply to maintain your dignity, follow your training, and trust that good discipline will ultimately triumph over entitled chaos. As the morning crowds gathered once again, Marcus stood perfectly still, rifle at attention, eyes focused straight ahead. He was once again the perfect statue, the living symbol of British military tradition. But now everyone watching understood that beneath the ceremonial uniform was a man of genuine substance, someone who had proven that real strength comes not from dominating others but from maintaining your principles even under pressure. The shocking truth wasn't that a spoiled child had been put in his place, or that an entitled mother had faced consequences for her actions. The real shock was how rare it had become to see someone simply do their duty with dignity and professionalism, and how hungry the world had been for exactly that example. In the end, Marcus Thompson had done nothing more complicated than his job. But in a world full of people demanding special treatment, simply doing your job with honor had become a revolutionary act.